Since it first started tumbling into Ireland through the old pirate coves of West Cork and in the stomachs of drug mules coming from Miami, cocaine has become the drug of our nation. It has swept in like a blizzard, dusting every corner of every small town, and so swift and total has its spread been that the Irish are now some of the biggest users in the world. But to unravel how a small island like ours on the edge of Europe ended up such a big player in the major cocaine leagues, we must follow the white supply lines back to the beginning. We must follow the routes it has taken as it travels across the globe. And most importantly, we need to follow the cowboys who put us on the map. So join me, Nicola Talent, for my new live show, Cocaine Cowboys, the story of Ireland's love affair with Colombia's biggest export. Limited tickets now available for February 10th at the Lime Tree Theatre in Limerick, February 15th in Cork's Everyman, and at Dublin's 3 Olympia on Sunday, February 18th. Tickets available at venues or on mcd.ie. Eamon, John Coone is a classic sort of regional drugs kingpin that was targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau after he was profiled locally, from what we know. And his case has eventually come to court. There's a couple of aspects to it, and I suppose maybe we'll start with who he is.
Well, he certainly wasn't a household name. You know, when you often hear about cab cases, it's someone relatively famous, and it doesn't take a lot of Googling on our parts to find out who they are. So, I mean, when John Coone and his wife, Pamela Coone, but also known as Pamela Murphy, when they appeared, I think you did a couple of stories back in 2020 when they first appeared on the cab list, and we were kind of getting hints and bits and pieces of, you know, he was involved in drug dealing and all the rest, and she had a beauty company set up. But this week then what happened was it went to full hearing. So they didn't actually contest it. So there was no sign of Mr. and Mrs. Coone. No, they didn't turn up. So it was basically a matter of running through the belief affidavit and the grounding affidavit of one of the guards who had put together, you know, all his criminal background. And from that, we heard a picture of a guy who had a couple of convictions for drugs. But there were nothing terribly major. Like he was convicted of one for sale and supply, which he was quite aggrieved about on the basis that it wasn't a whole lot of drugs. But that was thrown out on appeal. And so really, I suppose it would have been the local guards would have known about him. I suppose, and the local users.
This is in Fermoy, of course.
And well, he's we know now he's in Bandon, West Cork. So it's out of the city. It's, you know, it's kind of, I don't know. It's West Cork. There's plenty of poets and crazy painters and all the artistic set do enjoy that part of the country. Of course, there's lots of regular people there, and obviously there's people who are, you know, looking to use drugs in that region. Now he was described as being pretty much a major player in the region, but there was a couple of hints that came up. Actually, it was interesting enough to show that he probably has, you know, connections further afield. It did mention that he was involved in the importation of drugs and not just sale and supply. And curiously enough, you know, the various assets they went after was a bunch of vehicles, but one of them was actually bought from Bone Motors, which, as you know, we've discussed here before, was recently itself the target of a cab action, and was basically described as, I think it was basically described as a vehicle set up to launder the drugs cash of the Limerick gangs. So there was a Land Rover bought for a €7,000 deposit, you know, with no explanation where that came from, and it was bought on finance, and apparently there wasn't a whole lot of payments made back to the finance company. So I mean, it just shows you that there's connections everywhere, you know. I suppose, like in terms of his previous, he certainly wouldn't have featured on the pages of the Sunday World at any stage until he finally kind of made it onto the cab list. And as you say, it was the local guards picked it up, and it was their lifestyle, and very much it was the foreign holidays that they were doing.
So in February 2020, 120 Gardaí searched 21 premises linked to Coone, including the wife's cosmetic surgery practice in Bandon. That was actually a beautician's, not a rather cosmetic surgery. And that was major, you see, That was a huge Garda presence in an area like that. I think there was some links to Fermoy and another part of Cork, maybe called Ballyvohan, where they had... Ballyvolane, sorry, yeah, where they were... there was business premises and that searched. But that was so major. I think that was one of the biggest kind of Garda raids, certainly in that Cork area, in years and years and years. And it was after that we took ourselves down there to try and sort of see what we could see. Now, I was expecting at that time to see the big flashy house, the cars, to be able to see what you see, which is, probably the high-spec windows on the house, the cameras dotted all over it, and, maybe other trappings of wealth. But instead, is John Coone clever, or does he spend his money just and lash it all? It's hard to tell, because instead of that, we discovered they were living in a rental property outside Bandon, on a quiet country road. It certainly was no way flash. There was cars that were kind of okay. The business premises, the wife's business premises, was small. We watched it for a considerable period of time. Not a single customer went into it, but it was one of those little tiny things that you could go in apparently and get Botox and filler and your nails done.
Actually, the appointment book for the company that you were looking at came up. It was mentioned in court this week, and they mentioned it was pretty much empty.
Yeah. So, that's what it looked like. Now, it was definitely, you could see in, and it was very high spec done up, but, and she was in there actually, and then he arrived, and we did approach them and asked them about the raids at the time, and I think we got short shift. But you look on their social media, they're flashy with those holidays, definitely. 6 weeks, I think you said, or 5 weeks in Santorini.
Yeah, 6 weeks in Santorini pretty much during lockdown. I think Judge Alex Owens was a little bit interested, and he seemed to know exactly what dates the lockdowns came in, because he mentioned being stuck somewhere himself, and he says, it looks like they got away just the day before the lockdown happened.
Oh, so really?
He wasn't suggesting that they were in breach of the lockdown restrictions.
He's top of his game, that man, isn't he?
Certainly, he knows his dates and facts and figures, all right.
And you see, when they were in Santorini, they were, they had been raided. They were obviously subject to an investigation. And, the investigation, when it launched in 2020, was not just a Criminal Assets Bureau investigation. It was, a criminal investigation as well into John Coone's activities. The cab part of it was one thing. But there was this sense that they were splashing a load of money on fancy holidays, and they had 6 children, of course, sort of cars. There was a bit of jewellery, bit of bling, but no fixed assets. And I think that's what was kind of came to the fore when the Criminal Assets Bureau actually got into court and they didn't contest it. It was literally some cars and a few handbags.
Yeah, that's it. It was basically a Land Rover, a Volkswagen Passat that was bought for 10 grand, a Kia Sportage for 23. I can't remember the fourth car now. It was nothing, it wasn't, a top end sort of vehicle, and a couple of designer handbags, and that was it.
And that was after their finances were gone through with a fine-tooth comb. Now, there was evidence there was a lot of money travelling through their accounts.
Yeah.
And maybe what's telling is the evidence that was given about John Coone's particular habit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, they followed the money trail, and that's probably why there were so many raids, that there was different credit unions mentioned, there was different bank accounts mentioned. You had his brother, the car was in his name. One of the cars was in his name. He had no involvement in crime, the brother who's mentioned in the proceedings. And the same with his mother. She had control of bank accounts into which something like 66,000 went in her case. And the empty business, Riverview Aesthetics, that had very few customers, that you watched, and as the dust gathered on the welcome mat, had 220,000 go through it in the bank accounts that Pamela controlled. And her declared income from one of the years in that business was €2,000. So that was her complete, and so basically her only earnings were social welfare, and John Coone had none, going back to as far as I think 2007 or something like that. He had no legitimate income, and yet he was able to completely lose 30,000 with Boyle Sports, and he lodged another 68,000 with Paddy Power. Now, we didn't get to hear whether or not he lost all that, but I think the point was made by counsel for Cab that they couldn't use gambling as a source of his income because he was so bad at it. He was just basically losing money. So it was one-way traffic. So
gamblers can lose a ferocious amount of money, especially if they're prolific. Most gamblers are pretty bad at it. Actually, there's very few professionals that actually make a living out of it.
And I'm sure he could have gambled away money that wasn't, in a place or somewhere that the Cab were going to be able to track it or find it easily. So it's quite more. I mean, there was a little hint as to how much he was earning when there was mention. Again, this is kind of part of the belief evidence to support the fact that he was a criminal, where there was an 18,000 euro seizure of cocaine purportedly belonging to Coone, and he told the guards that's only a week's wages. And then on top of that, then another detective, or another officer rather, was reported that Coone had told him he'd triple his wages for any tip-off coming up in the future. So he obviously was confident that he'd be able to lay his hands on that kind of cash pretty quickly if his outrageous attempt to bribe a member of the Garda Síochána had come to fruition. I'm sure he would have been able to dip into his cash pot,
Confident or stupid?
I suppose it's putting up a front, isn't it? It's playing the game, and we've seen that so many times, some of these guys, I mean, it's the complete opposite when they end up in front of the special criminal court or in, they're pleading guilty and then all of a sudden the mitigation rolls out and it's the terrible childhood and they were, beaten as a child and they have asthma and they've been on medication for this and that and, and they've had a terrible life and they're so sorry and they're never going to do it again. So then you get this side of it then when they're on the side where they're probably not, they know they're not in any danger. I mean, even his one sentence that we saw there for 2012, he got a year for that. So, I mean, he hasn't done any serious time. And they've linked him to, say, another seizure of 141,000 of heroin. That was in a car linked to him. I think it was a surveillance operation, but it wasn't there when they lifted him. Mm-hmm. So, he's been, you can argue he's smart or lucky, but I mean, he's going to have to stay lucky all the time. But, he is...
They were certainly outrageous, really. I mean, in the aftermath of the massive big cab raids, which were all over the news, in the aftermath of their outing on the front page of the Sunday World and, photographs of that Botox business and everything, they just carried on. And in actual fact, a year after the raids in 2021, on the official, and it was called I'll just get this right. Riverview Aesthetics Limited was the company, yeah? Was that the one named?
Yeah, that's the one named. Yeah.
It was announced publicly on the company website, on the beautician's website, that they were expanding. They were going to open another business. At this point, they'd been raided. They were under investigation. They had been publicly named and shamed. And they were carrying on regardless. And that was the sense, I have to say, I got when I went down to Bandon at the time. There was a sense that this had been going on. They'd been living it up. Everybody knew what they were doing. They were sort of rubbing everybody's noses in it with the spend in particular that they were going on with all these holidays and the social media that went with it. And that nothing was being done about them. And there was this sort of sense of despair nearly within the community that everybody else was working hard, struggling to pay their bills, their mortgages. And here were this pair, she on the dole. And I think at the time, from memory, there was some state help with their accommodation. And yet they were drug dealing openly. They were, this was the kind of the narrative. And in a way, that's what CAB is about as well. It's not just about seizing big value assets and putting that money into the exchequer. It's very much about sort of stopping that kind of thing within communities.
And it is about sending that message, and it's about, we'll take whatever assets we can, and it does disrupt them. It pushes them deeper to hide their money. So they have to look for different methods to launder their money. Like in Coone's case, I mean, they were suggesting that his wife's business was being used to launder the cash. That that the 220,000 that went through her accounts, at least half of that went into, the tanning beds and the equipment, and it was an empty unit, so it was fitted out apparently to an impressive level, I think was the terminology used in court this week. So
I'm sure those tanning beds are really expensive.
I have no idea.
They must be. They're they'd be specialist, and I'd say all that equipment is super dear.
And again, like and the point was that there was no explanation for the money where this came from.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think it was, as Judge Owens put it, like he had little option but to decide that this was the proceeds of crime. That there was no other explanation. I mean, there was even the €3,900 in cash, like that they found in his mother's house. I mean, that again there was no, like, this is a lady on a pension. That's her only income. And yet has this amount of cash. So basically it all stemmed from Coone's drug dealing, from his activities and what he was making.
It is unusual, however, for, a criminal assets bureau, it's certainly a localised regional, shall we call him kingpin, who has been profiled, because the profilers usually identify the takeable assets, shall we say, of somebody before the Criminal Assets Bureau come in to investigate, because they're not going to sort of throw all the resources and their money when there isn't anything for the state to benefit from. So in the case of the Coones, this was a multi-pronged offensive against them and the wider gang and the wider operation, really. This wasn't just criminal assets. This was also about, drugs and organised crime. And obviously that is ongoing as an investigation. And his links with Bun Motors in Limerick, which was a large money laundering outfit for many criminal gangs. But those local profilers, and they're trained up all over the country, ordinary members of the local Gardaí, they're facilitated with training in how to actually identify what can be taken. I suppose it's like if you were going to sue somebody, you'd need to make sure they had enough money that they weren't completely broke. So you'd be throwing your money at nothing,
Yeah.
But that's what those local profilers do. You can see in the cases, though, how many of these sort of more rural and regional cases are coming in before the courts all the time.
And you'll see, again, even in Coone's case, what a lot of these guys are now doing is that they're if they're going to buy property or something that they can't hide or just rent, they buy it abroad. And there was evidence in one of the raids that they carried out of a property in Bulgaria, but they've no details of where this property is, or certainly, it wasn't part of the case against them. And we can see that in, even Jerry the Monk Hutch, with a lot of his extensive properties abroad. I think there was suggestions of change to the proceeds of crime legislation this week.
I was only reading
might
about
make
it
it
this
easier.
week, yeah. I was going to ask you about that, and then I thought, am I going to hit you with that now? And you haven't. But yes, there's...
But I don't see how it's going to work, because...
You're not?
No, because, you need the other jurisdictions to cooperate. So,
Maybe some of them will.
They have done in the past, and what we have seen in some cases is where a property has been identified, and only if the person who's the target of CAB agrees to settle and says, look, we'll sell it off and we'll give you the money. And in which case, leave the family home in Dublin alone or whatever. And I think there's been one or two instances of that. But CAB have to find the evidence. So, if somebody really wants to be clever and, they're able to get their suitcase of drug money to, I don't know, Dubai or wherever, and they're able to buy, €500,000 apartment in somewhere nice, that's their investment. So that's what they're going to do. And it, in the best will in the world, CAB are never going to be able to take that apartment off them. And it's, and the argument that, again, there is political change will have to happen in the places like Dubai.
There's been some incidents, though, that the UK have identified properties abroad in Spain and stuff, and those properties have been taken. Now, does the money go into the Spanish exchequer then, or?
It depends. They might do it as I kind of see it in some of the cases that have happened. It's up to somebody's lawyer to execute the sale in the foreign country and then hand over the money. And it's obviously part of a deal done. But they'd be under no obligation to it, in that sense. And sometimes these guys will do a deal. Thank God they've only identified one of my properties. Let's play dumb here.
Yeah.
And say nothing about the other 7 I've bought. So, which is quite possible. It's... When you get to that level, it gets easier to launder your money. Once you break into the hundreds of thousands and possibly the millions, because you can change hands, you can set up offshore companies. You keep your money out of Ireland, you keep it out of reach of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and obviously keep it away from the likes of the Americans as well, who seem to, if they take an interest in you, will go after you. But in one sense, it's not rocket science. And once you get the right accountants, once you get the right tax advisors in these countries, and once you have your connections and you're able to trust your intermediaries who are going to buy stuff in your name, then you're almost untouchable.
I'd say the chances of them going after. But funny enough, back to the UK situation, I know in the case of just the most recent sort of proceeds of crime that I've been aware of there, which is against Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, it's up to them to give a list of all their assets to the courts in the UK. And obviously they get extra time if they don't in prison if they don't give a full list. So there's obviously some investigation in the background there that they're not just leaving it up to the trustworthy criminals to give a list of what they own. But
I suppose they're making them sell it and give them the money in that sense, because but they're not going to a court in Spain.
They give them a bill. They actually add up how much everything is worth. Like in his case, he has very expensive villas in Mallorca that they are aware of. So they add up that, they work out what the bill is going to be, and say they might hit him with 10 million. You owe us 10 million. If he doesn't pay the 10 million, he gets an extra 10 years in jail.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think in the
it's a shortcut, I suppose, isn't it?
Well, maybe, maybe it is. You don't see them in the UK actively going after identifying assets and bringing, looking to seize them. But maybe in a way, when you're dealing with sort of other territories and countries abroad, it's probably the easier way of doing it.
Because I think the Assets Recovery Agency, which I don't think exists now in the UK, they had a tough beginning, and it was basically they were trying to copy the Criminal Assets Bureau, and ironically enough, their first big case was an Irish guy, Dylan Creven, who was involved in that colossal VAT fraud, the carousel VAT fraud, and whatever he's supposed to have. It was 17 million worth, but they thought it was much bigger. It was something like £500 million pounds of tax money was paid out to all these fake companies. And they hit him for 17 million, and they took him to court, and he actually won his case, but he did settle. And I remember we got a couple of legal missives off him at that time when he'd set up his new business. But I suppose a leopard doesn't change his spots, because he's serving a long stretch now for operating a boiler room scam. So he got imprisoned there back in 2018, I think, again in the UK. So after all, I'm not a criminal. Turns out he was.
And is he still in?
He's still in, as far as I can see. I was making a few inquiries in the last couple of weeks to see. And this is a guy who, he was, I think, in one of the computer magazines as a young hotshot at the time, back in whenever it was. Jesus, a long time ago now, 20 plus years ago. And he was sponsoring a local rugby team down in Limerick, and I think flew them to Japan for a rugby tour known as Hollywood. He was and he was a decent athlete, I think, as well. He was into his ultra marathons and stuff like that. And he used to put it up on his social media. He was doing it for good causes and all the rest, while his acolytes were on the phone, hammering the phones, trying to con vulnerable people out of their hard-earned cash.
He just couldn't help himself, that guy. What else has been up in the cab cases of interest?
Well, we had
John Coone, because, any more of these sort of regional type.
Well, Magog Gartley was an interesting one, in that they were fighting this case for quite some time now. It's coming up to, this is the 4th year. It's not quite 4 years. Himself and his partner, Charlene Lamb. And they were after the house in Coolock, which the cab have said they have spent 440,000 on.
Right.
Now, there was a lot of rigmarole about getting legal aid on their behalf. And this is when we heard all about, their exotic holidays, the cruises to the Far East and the Caribbean and all the rest of it. It was, I think, eye-watering was the phrase used in court at the time. Well, it sounded good, all right.
Yeah.
But anyway, they've no money now.
When were all those cruises and everything? Because Magog Gartley has been, he's been under threat of death for a long time.
It was pre-feud, very much so. I can't remember the exact dates. But this is all used in evidence, saying that this is why we shouldn't give them legal aid. But I think the judge took the view that, well, there's evidence that they had lots of money, but there's no evidence to suggest that they have any now. And so it came down to then they got the free legal aid, and then there was back and forth. There was changing of solicitors, and they couldn't find a forensic accountant and a quantity surveyor to carry out the work and do expert reports to show that there's no way this kind of money was spent on the house. And they were suggesting that, the Gartley's defence were suggesting that they'd sourced cheaper materials, they'd done some of the work themselves. So this is going back and forth, and it's dragged it all out. There was even, I think there was costs coming up for, I don't know, something like £34,000, to carry out a report. And the judge said, this is your favourite judge, Jones, again. And he was saying, what's that for? And they said, well, it's going to take him, 22 hours or whatever the number was, or 18 hours to read the report. And he says, well, I did it in 8, so I'm going to give him 8 hours at that rate. So
it's a beat, like.
So he capped it at 14 grand or something. So anyway, eventually so this week, this month, whatever it is, where are we? January.
Yeah.
So the January list, it was mentioned that they finally have a draft copy of the quantity surveyor's report, but they have now 10 days to file the original, like the official draft, and it's going to be heard now in March. And after all that, the bulk of the work that the report focused on, like Cab said, was 384,000, and their quantity surveyor, hired by Gartley's team, came up with a figure of 382. So there was a 2 grand difference. So we've spent, I don't know, the best part of 2 years, like back and forth, the case dragging itself through the courts, despite, Judge Owen saying you got to get a move on, or I'm just going to go straight to hearing. And it was all over 2 grand of the difference. So anyway, it's March now when this is going to be finally heard.
Right. And the state are looking for that house, or they're looking for...
But do you know what? They actually haven't opened the full case, so we don't actually know, but I presume it is the house that they're after. And
is there any evidence when the house was bought?
No, we haven't heard that yet. But it is it's been his home for quite some time. I know that there's pictures that we've Sunday World have used in the past, and it goes back some time.
They certainly had a business. I think he had a shop, did he not?
Yeah, there was different. Yeah, he was mentioned in relation to different businesses, including I think a beauty business as well and stuff like that.
Right. Of course, he has survived a shooting in May of 2017. Kalyn Smith is serving a 20-year jail term in relation to that. He was shot at a garage in his car and brought to hospital, refused to make a statement, but allegedly shouted that the feud won't end till Daniel Kinahan's dead or something like this from the hospital bed. Delirious, I'm sure, on medication. A month previous, he was unaware that there was a plot to kill him.
Yeah. And the details of that were chilling when you had
absolutely
a ruckus over from Estonia, and they had exactly where he parked his car in the underground car park in Newry and stuff like that. So, I mean, that sounded like it was a pretty serious attempt on his life.
I'd say he was, sure, look at the police saved his life in that case. Do you know what I mean? Because, it was information coming in from Lithuania and Estonia about the movements of Arrakis. That's the only reason that the cops were on him, Arrakis, from as soon as he landed, because he was wanted for a murder in Lithuania and Estonia, and they were watching him, wherever he was travelling. And they'd noticed that he'd come to Ireland a few times. They knew then, Europol, that there was a feud on in Ireland, and they knew he had connections to the south coast of Spain. So when he booked a flight from Alicante to Dublin, they alerted the cops, and literally, incredibly, they managed to scramble. The information came very late. They managed to scramble an officer out to Dublin Airport, who literally hopped on the bus with Arrakis as he went into the city centre and managed to tail him all day until he was picked up and brought out to Blakestown cottages, where he was arrested the next morning. So that was, Magog Gartley must have 9 lives. I feel that there was another... there was certainly lots of plots to kill him, but I think there might have been another one that was upended by the Gardaí. But anyway, nonetheless, so that's, it's expensive to live like that, though, at the same time, and whatever money you do have, I'm sure.
There was, and I suppose the international connections, I think, between the gangs was also obvious in one of the other cab cases that we can mention from this week. There was a couple called Natalie and Edward Chyper, which you did a piece about as well in the past when they first came up. Very glamorous on social media, looked great and all the rest. They were arrested with a substantial amount of cannabis a couple of years ago. I think the number was 1.6 million or something like that. And but the Director of Public Prosecutions, anyway, they opted not to bring charges against them. But then, lo and behold, like earlier this year, they were part of they were targets of the Criminal Assets Bureau. And this week, the only thing we learned, it hasn't come to a kind of full hearing yet. And it's actually a big house outside of Drogheda, as it was put, is the target of CAB. And this is what this case is about. So presumably their home or whatever property they had bought is being sought after by CAB. So yeah, I just have it here now. So they were arrested in January 2019, and that there was just under €1 million worth of cannabis found in a County Louth premises.
Right.
But the charges were dropped. I mean, I think they both spent a bit of time initially on remand before they were given bail, and then the whole thing was dropped.
Where are they from?
They're Moldovans.
Moldovans, right, okay.
So hopefully, as it winds on, we'll get to hear exactly what their role was in the ecosystem. That
case is sort of just begun there.
I guess it's gone past the Section 2 part where there's the initial hearing, and so
when it goes past that, from memory, you can't report on it until it goes past that.
It's in camera until basically the Section 3, which is to actually declare the proceeds of crime. Or you can report after the Section 2, and so there's legal aid argument and all the rest. And this week, then I think really what it was about this week was they were just saying, oh yeah, well look, we're cooperating, and I think they were talking about they were in talks with CAB, which the counsel for CAB said, well, that's misconceived, I think was the word used. We're not actually in talks. Okay. We're waiting for you to return a replying affidavit, actually. So there's a bit of, they are defending the case, or they're engaging at least, I suppose, with CAB. They've entered a defence, which is the first step. Right. Whereas, the likes of John Coone, just ignored it really.
Yeah. No, he's an interesting character, Coone, and be interesting to know where he is now. If anybody's listening, are they still in Bandon? Have they moved? Have they, certainly there was a lot of bad feelings about them, I think you'd say, in the area where they were living, and there was a lot of information forthcoming as a result of that. So it'd be interesting to see where they are and what they're up to. So there's loads in that, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was great to be here.
Yeah. Right, Eamon. Thanks a million.
Nicola. That's great.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.